In the years leading up to June 6, 1944, German soldiers along the French coast lived under the shadow of a colossal promise: Hitler's assurance that the Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. Stretching more than 2,400 kilometers from the northern tip of Norway to the border of neutral Spain, the wall was presented to the world as an impregnable fortress, a steel and concrete shield that would crush any Allied attempt to invade Western Europe. Propaganda reels showed massive gun casements, thick concrete bunkers, and endless fields of mines as proof that Fortress Europe was secure. And for the ordinary German infantrymen assigned to those positions, that message became doctrine. The wall would hold, the Allies would bleed, and no army on earth could storm these beaches. But the truth beneath the boast was different, far more fragile. The Atlantic Wall was an engineering project Germany never had the manpower, materials, or time to finish. By the summer of 1944, large sections were incomplete or undermanned. Many batteries lacked ammunition. Others were staffed with Osttruppen, conscripts from the east whose morale and training were limited. Even the elite positions, like those guarding the cliffs and bluffs above Omaha Beach, depended on a thin line of companies from the 35th 2nd Infantry Division, a formation stretched dangerously across 45 kilometers of coastline. Yet the soldiers did not feel vulnerable. They believed in the wall, in the myth of its impregnability. They believed in the towering bunkers of steel-reinforced concrete, the labyrinth of trenches, the fields of Belgian gates, hedgehogs, and mined obstacles waiting to tear apart landing craft. They believed that any attacker would be trapped in the killing zones they had rehearsed for months. At Omaha Beach, the German defense consisted of a network of Widerstandsnests, resistance nests, each engineered to crossfire into the next. WN-60, WN-61, WN-62, WN-64, and WN-72 formed a lethal arc of machine gun, artillery, and mortar positions. Bunkers housed 75mm guns designed to sweep the beach laterally, while pillboxes mounted MG-34s and MG-42s whose 1,200 round-per-minute fire rate could shred entire assault waves. Behind them, trenches zigzagged across the bluffs, stocked with grenades, ammunition crates, and hardened firing points. These emplacements were not just static, they were integrated with telephone lines, observation posts, and fire direction centers hidden further inland. The defenders genuinely believed that the wall would funnel attackers into a slaughter. Yet even as the Germans trained and fortified, the ground beneath their certainty was shifting. A fortress is only as strong as the men manning it, and by late 1943, the Wehrmacht was stretched thin. Many Atlantic Wall units were understrength. Others relied on captured French guns with limited spare parts. Rommel, tasked with improving coastal defenses, warned that the wall was nowhere near complete, and that without armored reserves close to the shore, no static defense could survive the kind of invasion the Allies were capable of launching. His warnings were ignored. The High Command insisted that the wall itself would break any attack long before panzer divisions were needed. German soldiers at Omaha had no reason to doubt this confidence. They saw the concrete casements, walls 2 meters thick, built to withstand naval bombardment. They watched as engineers laid minefields stretching hundreds of meters deep. They patrolled past anti-tank ditches carved through wheat fields and along cliff edges. They watched the sea, convinced that no fleet could pass through the crosshairs of their guns. To the defenders, the wall was not just a defensive line, it was a psychological bulwark. It meant safety, superiority, inevitability. Even as Allied bombers roared overhead in the months before D-Day, the Germans considered it a prelude at most. They believed that any landing craft would be trapped in a storm of steel before reaching the sand. They believed the Allies would choose Calais, not Normandy. And they believed the United States lacked the will to hurl tens of thousands of young men directly into fortified gunfire. But the reality, unknown to the men watching the channel from their bunkers, was that the Atlantic Wall was about to face the greatest amphibious fleet ever assembled. They did not know that 6,939 Allied vessels, from battleships to LCVPs, were preparing to cross the channel. They did not know that naval gunfire support teams had spent months mapping every German battery. They did not know that airborne divisions were already in the sky by the time they ate their evening meal on June 5th. They did not know that weather, timing, and Allied deception operations had aligned perfectly to deliver the blow they believed could never come. For now, on the eve of D-Day, the defenders of Omaha Beach sat inside their bunkers, convinced they held the high ground, literally and figuratively. They trusted their minds, they trusted their obstacles, they trusted their guns, and above all, they trusted the wall. Within hours, that trust would shatter. Within hours, the myth of Fortress Europe would be exposed. And within hours, the most feared defensive line in Hitler's empire would crumble under the weight of an invasion its builders never truly believed could happen. In the first pale light of June 6, 1944, the German defenders of Omaha Beach blinked into the dawn, expecting another quiet morning, perhaps punctuated by distant aircraft or random naval patrols. Instead, they saw the unimaginable. Through the thinning fog, the horizon seemed to thicken, darken, and then move. An impossible shifting wall of steel, stretching from one end of the world to the other. What they were seeing was the largest invasion fleet in human history. 6,939 Allied vessels, from battleships and cruisers to transport ships, LSTs, and hundreds upon hundreds of landing craft racing across the channel. The German batteries had never trained for this. Their doctrine had never imagined this. Their confidence in the Atlantic Wall cracked the moment they realized the sea itself had turned into an armada. Inside bunker after bunker, German soldiers scrambled to their firing ports. Telephones rang frantically across the 352nd Infantry Division's coastal command posts. Officers demanded confirmation. Was it real? Was it the invasion? Was it a feint? But one look through a periscope slit settled every argument. This was no deception. This was a tidal wave of men and machines backed by more naval guns than any army in history had ever unleashed at one time. At 4:30, the first shells from Allied battleships screamed over the water, exploding across the bluffs and fortifications. German gunners inside WN-62, WN-61, WN-60, and WN-72 felt the bunker shake as 14-inch shells detonated with earth-moving force. The concussion rattled their teeth, knocked helmets off racks, and sent dust cascading from concrete ceilings. Many defenders were stunned by the violence of the bombardment, not because it was unexpected in theory, but because their training had told them the bunkers would shrug it off. And although the thick concrete did absorb most direct hits, the psychological shock was immediate. Yet when the naval guns paused, German soldiers peered out and saw something unnerving. The armada was still coming, untouched and unstoppable. The sea was alive with LCTs, LCVPs, and LCMs cutting through the waves like swarms of mechanized insects. The fog and smoke hid their exact numbers, but the scale was unmistakable. No amount of MG-42 fire, no minefield, no coastal battery could stop tens of thousands of men advancing from the water. At 6 a.m., the first assault waves of the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division began their approach. Many landing craft drifted off course due to currents stronger than expected. Smoke from naval bombardment obscured landmarks. Some units landed hundreds of meters from their designated sectors. But to the Germans staring down from WN-62 and WN-61, this disorganization seemed irrelevant. They saw dozens upon dozens of Higgins boats turning toward the beach, far more than they had ever expected. Their first wave estimates had predicted a few hundred men at a time. Now they were witnessing thousands. The German defenders realized with dread that no simulation, no training exercise, no map had prepared them for this. They had assumed the Atlantic Wall's obstacles, Belgian gates, hedgehogs, mines, barbed wire, would delay or destroy the attackers. But the sheer number of landing craft made this irrelevant. Even if obstacles sank dozens, dozens more would make it through. At 6:30,
The ramps dropped. The first wave stepped into deep water, and many were cut down immediately by the precise overlapping fields of fire that the Germans had rehearsed for months. But to the shock of the defenders, the Americans did not retreat. They pushed forward, wave after wave, dragged under the surf, shredded by machine guns, yet always replaced by more. From inside WN-62, the defenders watched the beach fill not with broken assault waves, but with a slow, unstoppable accumulation of men and equipment. MG teams switched barrels as fast as they could to prevent overheating. Riflemen fired until their shoulders bruised. Grenadiers hurled stick grenades until their belts were empty, but every time they scanned the sand, more Americans were rising behind obstacles, crawling through troughs, pressing against shingle ridges, taking cover behind the dead and wounded. By 7 a.m., German officers realized this was no longer a battle of tactics, it was a battle of math. The Atlantic Wall had been built under the assumption that the German defenders would face modest, manageable landing forces. It had not been designed to absorb an ocean of soldiers, backed by a navy powerful enough to erase entire positions with a single broadside. Yet the German shock deepened further when they recognized that this massive assault was only a fraction of the Allied force. Omaha was just one of 5 beaches, and even here, the ships continued arriving, wave after wave after wave. At 8 a.m., the German defenders finally grasped the scale of the catastrophe unfolding before them. Their wall, the structure they believed would protect Europe, was collapsing not because the bunkers were weak, but because the enemy was too strong, too numerous, and too determined. As more landing craft rushed toward the shore, the Germans stood in disbelief. The Atlantic Wall was not a fortress, it was a speed bump. And on this morning, June 6, 1944, it was being crushed under the weight of the largest invasion fleet in human history. By 06:35, as the first assault wave struggled through the murderous surf of Omaha Beach, the German strongpoint that would become infamous, WN-62, fully opened fire. Positioned on the eastern bluffs overlooking sectors Dog Green and Easy Red, WN-62 was engineered to be the single deadliest knot of resistance on the entire 6-kilometer stretch of Omaha. Its fields of fire overlapped with WN-61 and WN-64, forming a triangular kill zone that funneled incoming troops into converging arcs of bullets, shells, and mortars. Inside the position, roughly 27 men of the 352nd Infantry Division, including machine gunner Heinrich Severloh and Oberleutnant Bernhard Freierking, snapped into trained mechanical rhythm the moment the Americans came into view. The weapons they commanded were brutally efficient, MG-42s firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute, a 75mm FK-16.A gun sweeping the beach laterally, and a network of 50 and 81mm mortars positioned behind the main casemates. From their vantage point, the Germans watched the first Higgins boats drop their ramps and watched chaos erupt. The first wave of Company A, 116th RCT, found itself directly in WN-62's crosshairs. Many soldiers stepped off into deep water weighted down by gear and sank before firing a shot. Those who reached the sand were met with MG-42 torrents so dense that survivors later said the air itself seemed to vibrate. Severloh and his loader worked in relentless cycles: belt, fire, barrel change, belt, fire, sending sweeping bursts that ripped across the flat, open killing ground. They fired until ammunition boxes were empty, then immediately opened new ones. They fired until barrels glowed, then swapped them out. They fired until the beach was covered with men who had barely managed to move a few feet. To the defenders, the effect seemed total. They saw platoons disintegrate before their eyes. Company A took over 60% casualties in minutes. Company B and C landed off target and were shredded as they tried to organize under direct fire. The mortars bracketed the shingle line with deadly accuracy, pounding clusters of men who had nowhere to hide. German spotters called adjustments over telephone lines still intact, and every correction tightened the lethal pattern. The defenders believed, for a short, terrible moment, that the wall was working exactly as promised, that no force on earth could survive what they were unleashing. But then something happened that the German defenders had not prepared for. The Americans refused to stop coming. Wave after wave pushed forward, despite being cut down. Men crawled through the surf using bodies, scrap metal, and anti-landing obstacles as cover. Combat engineers, many from the Navy's demolition teams, dragged Bangalore torpedoes across the sand under machine gun fire, trying to blast paths through the wire. Others clawed up the shingle line inch by inch, digging shallow depressions with their helmets as bullets hammered the pebbles around them. By 07:15, WN-62's defenders noticed something unsettling. The volume of landed troops was increasing, not decreasing. Instead of retreating, the Americans were gathering in numbers too large to suppress. The German guns were inflicting horrific losses, yet the beach was beginning to fill with pockets of survivors. 5 men here, 8 men there. Small, isolated groups that would normally be crushed easily. But these groups were not staying pinned. They were observing the firing patterns, studying the slope of the bluffs, and looking for cracks. Meanwhile, the German defenders were experiencing the first signs of strain. MG-42 barrels overheated faster under sustained fire. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Mortar crews rushed forward more rounds than they could track. Telephone lines began to fail as naval shells struck nearby. And most critically, the Germans realized that they faced not 1 or 2 companies, but an entire division landing in depth. At 07:30, the 2nd and 3rd waves of the 1st Infantry Division crashed into the beach. Fragments of companies E, F, and G emerged from the surf, battered but more organized than the earlier assault. They carried radios that survived the landing, they dragged the wounded into cover, they returned fire where possible, and small unit leaders, sergeants, lieutenants, corporals, began forming ad hoc assault teams. Inside WN-62, Severlo and the other machine gunners saw a new pattern that alarmed them. The Americans were starting to move laterally, crawling along the shingle to exit the beaten zones. They were beginning to probe the weak seams between WN-62 and neighboring strongpoints. And once they reached those seams, they could exploit dead ground, areas the MG-42s could not reach. By 0800, mortar teams in WN-62 were firing blind into smoke that now blanketed much of the beach. The visibility that had made their opening volleys so lethal had turned against them. In the haze, it was impossible to tell how many Americans were advancing, but every few minutes another group appeared, climbing, scrambling, or sprinting from cover to cover. Severlo continued firing, but the effect was changing. The targets were no longer clustered. The Americans were spread out, dispersed, unpredictable, and moving. And worst of all, they were getting closer. The German defenders had inflicted some of the most devastating casualties of the war's opening hours. Yet as they watched the tide of men rise again and again, they realized for the first time that the wall was facing something it had not been built for, an enemy who would take staggering losses and simply keep coming. The Atlantic Wall was killing at a terrifying rate, but the Americans were not breaking. They were adapting. They were pushing, and they were beginning to edge towards the one outcome the Germans had believed impossible: penetration of the strongpoints themselves.
By 0830, the German defenders at Omaha Beach began to sense something they had never expected to feel on D-Day. The wall was no longer holding the enemy in place. It was holding them in place just long enough for them to find ways around it. What had begun as scattered, desperate clusters of survivors on the sand was transforming into coordinated, intelligent, and terrifyingly persistent infiltration. The Atlantic Wall, engineered to annihilate massed assaults, was being undone by the very thing its planners never anticipated: 5-man groups, 8-man teams, small units acting independently and improvising under fire. On the beach below WN-62 and WN-61, non-commissioned officers, sergeants, corporals, privates first class, were taking charge as officers fell. Men like Staff Sergeant Raymond C. Thorne, Lieutenant John Spaulding, Sergeant Philip Stresick, and dozens more whose names would never appear in history books, began crawling up goat paths, drainage ditches, and grassy folds in the bluffs. These were dead ground approaches, places the German MG-42s could not reach due to the angle of their embrasures. The German defenders, trained to fire into kill zones on the beach, suddenly faced enemies who were not where they were supposed to be.
By 0845, one of the first true breakthroughs occurred between WN-64 and WN-65. A group of about a dozen men from the 1st Infantry Division, led by Lieutenant Spaulding and Strechik, discovered a narrow path, a natural cleft in the bluff. They crawled, then sprinted upward, dragging BARs, rifles, and grenades. Within minutes, they reached the crest, flanked WN-64 from behind, and began clearing trenches. The Germans, expecting frontal assaults only, were stunned when grenades exploded among them from their blind side. At nearly the same moment, further west on Dog Red, engineers began detonating Bangalore torpedoes, blowing gaps in the barbed wire and giving the stalled infantry their first real exits from the killing zones. The smoke from the explosions fused with naval gunfire residue, obscuring the Germans' line of sight. And that smoke, chaotic, drifting, unpredictable, became the Americans' first real ally of the morning. Then came a turning point no one in the Atlantic Wall command structure anticipated: the destroyers. Battleships and cruisers had been firing since dawn, but by 9 a.m., destroyers like the USS McCook, USS Carmack, and USS Doyle began doing what naval doctrine had never envisioned. They closed to within 800 to 1,000 meters of the beach, so close that some nearly ran aground. From these impossible distances, they fired their 5-inch guns directly into German strongpoints, aiming by spotters shouting corrections from the surf. Inside WN-62, the shock was immediate and devastating. The casemates shook violently with every near miss. Telephone lines snapped. Observation slits were choked with dust and smoke. Mortar teams were thrown to the floor. The 75mm gun crews tried to retaliate, but the destroyer's speed and angle made accurate return fire nearly impossible. Meanwhile, on the bluffs, American assault groups began multiplying. By 9:15, elements of the 116th RCT and the 16th RCT were fighting their way into the German trench networks. Individual WN positions, designed to fire outward onto the beach, were almost helpless against attackers appearing from above or behind. Machine gunners could not depress their weapons enough. Mortar crews had no time to reset their tubes. Riflemen fired frantically, but were flanked too quickly. The wall was cracking, not at one point, but at dozens. By 10 a.m., more breakthrough groups reached the top of the bluffs. They used trench grenades, rifle grenades, and captured German weapons to clear bunkers one by one. Some Germans surrendered. Others attempted to fight to the last round. But even the most determined defenders could not hold against multiple flanking attacks in terrain they had believed was impossible to climb. German command posts inland started receiving reports that made no sense. Americans in the trench line, enemy behind WN-65, WN-61 surrounded, WN-62 taking fire from above. For the first time, the defenders realized they were not fighting a frontal assault at all. They were being dismantled from angles they had never planned for by soldiers who were supposed to be dead on the beach. By 10:30, the wall's collapse was accelerating. On Easy Red, Easy Green, Dog White, and Dog Red, U.S. soldiers were pouring through holes blown open by engineers, naval gunfire, and sheer persistence. German positions began falling in a domino effect. Once the trench systems behind a WN was compromised, the strongpoint itself became a death trap. At 11 a.m., the situation at Omaha Beach was no longer a German defense. It was a German retreat. Some defenders fled inland under covering fire, others were captured, others were killed at their posts. But the truth was undeniable. The Atlantic Wall, this massive concrete and steel symbol of Hitler's promise, had not been destroyed by overwhelming artillery or tanks or elite paratroopers. It had been broken by small American units who refused to die, refused to stop, and refused to accept that the wall was unbreakable. By late morning, the German defenders looked down from the remaining strongpoints and saw an image they had believed impossible. Americans moving freely across the bluffs. Americans dismantling bunkers with satchel charges. Americans turning German guns inland. Americans everywhere, the wall had sworn they would never be. The wall had not just cracked, it had failed. By 12 o'clock, the German defenders who had survived the morning's chaos were confronted with the truth so shocking, so opposite to everything they had been taught, that many could not accept it, even as it unfolded before their eyes. The Atlantic Wall, the fabled barrier that Hitler promised would make any invasion impossible, had been broken, bypassed, overrun, and rendered meaningless in just a few brutal hours. What they saw across Omaha Beach was not a disorganized rabble of exhausted attackers, but an increasingly coordinated American force expanding inland, capturing crossroads, silencing rear guns, and establishing the beachhead that German High Command had assured them could never exist. The wall wasn't bending, it wasn't cracking, it was gone. The last functioning strongpoints, WN62, WN61, WN64, WN72, found themselves isolated. The trenches that once connected them to support positions were now crawling with American infantry. Machine gun nests that had dominated the beach at dawn were now taking rifle fire from the rear. German NCOs shouted orders that no longer matched the battlefield reality. Hold the line, fire on the beach, regroup on the ridge. But the Americans weren't on the beach anymore. They were behind the wall, inside its trench network, pushing deeper by the minute. Communications collapsed first. Telephone lines severed by naval fire left strong points blind. Runners sent to neighboring WNs never returned. Officers inland, including those from the 352nd Infantry Division, heard only fragments. Enemy through wire, casemate overrun, artillery suppressed, before silence consumed the network. Attempts to counterattack were impossible. The 352nd was already stretched thin, with companies spread across miles of coastline and reserves hours away. Worse, American naval gunfire and fighter bombers had shattered major road junctions, delaying any hope of organized reinforcement. By 12:30, German soldiers watched U.S. forces pour through the draws at E1, E3, and D1, the natural exits off Omaha Beach. Engineers marked safe lanes through minefields. Sherman tanks finally landed after delays, rolled up the bluffs, and began engaging remaining strongpoints from point-blank range. Once tanks reached the top of the cliffs, the German positions, designed to fire outward, were helpless. Their embrasures could not rotate. Their fields of fire were useless. A fortress built to repel a sea invasion had no answer for attackers already inside its walls. The defenders' shock deepened when they saw American artillery teams setting up on high ground, calling in fire on German movements inland. Within 6 hours, the invaders had transformed from vulnerable beach targets into the spearhead of a new front that Germany could neither contain nor predict. German officers who had believed in the propaganda of the Atlantic Wall now confronted the bitter reality. The wall had never been strong enough, not because the engineers had failed, but because the concept itself was flawed. A static defense line could not hold against an enemy willing to sacrifice, adapt, and overwhelm. The wall was designed to stop a small invasion, not a continental liberation force backed by the greatest naval armada ever assembled. Individual German accounts described the collapse with stunned disbelief. One artillery observer wrote, "By midday, the Americans were everywhere. We fired until we could not fire. They kept coming. The sea produced endless men." Another, captured near the Vierville draw, told his interrogators, "We were told the Atlantic Wall was invincible, but it was only strong where we could shoot. Once they got behind us, everything fell apart." By 1300, the battle for Omaha had shifted from the beach to the hedgerows inland. German survivors retreated towards Formigny, Coulterville, and St. Laurent, under fire from units they had expected to annihilate at dawn. Those still holding bunkers faced a stark choice: flee, fight surrounded, or surrender. Many chose the latter. Others were killed when tanks fired point-blank into embrasures. A few, including Severlo, fell back into the countryside, stunned to still be alive after witnessing the most catastrophic defensive failure in the history of the Wehrmacht. By 1400, Allied commanders declared that Omaha Beach, despite the horrific casualties and near disaster of the first waves, was secure enough to land reinforcements. The wall had not fallen neatly, it had not fallen quickly, it had fallen violently under the weight of courage, numbers, naval firepower, and small unit initiative that German doctrine had never accounted for. The shock among the defenders, those alive to feel it, was overwhelming. For years they had been told that Fortress Europe would defeat any assault. But as American flags were planted atop the bluffs, as landing craft unloaded fresh troops and supplies, and as naval guns shifted fire inland, the truth was undeniable. The Atlantic Wall was never a fortress, it was a facade, a line of concrete and hope. And on June 6, 1944, in the span of a single morning, under the relentless weight of men determined to climb through hell, that facade shattered beyond repair.